Coming up on a brand new episode of Wonder Room, we've reached the end of our journey as the playoffs have taken form. The Literals pulled off one of the greatest comeback stories in NWBA history, but can they keep it going now that they're actually in the playoffs proper? And who wins the rubber match between Coraway and Big Bluff? Would the veterans in Vasser and Kobe find a way to survive and advance, or would the newcomers in Cherry and Salame get the better of them? And would either of our one seeds fall victim to the big upset? More All-Star Game shenanigans as we've come to expect, and would we actually legitimately finally get a real exhibition? Hold on to your hats and check those stats. Playoff episode of Wonder Room starts now. Hello everyone and welcome back to Wonder Room. I'm your host King Vasser. Coming up on today's episode, we take a look at the playoffs and arrive at our final destination, the NWBA Finals. But we've got a lot to cover. Of course, we can't talk about the finals just yet because they haven't happened. We get to talk about what has actually transpired in the playoff bracket. But first things first, we've got an All-Star game to cover, so let's go ahead and take a dive and see which Mons were rewarded for their success in the regular season and ended up making it to the All-Star Celebration Night. So we start with the Ruby League All-Star roster for Season 8. The voting cutoff decided that it ended up being 14 Mons per league. And we start with Azoth of Sky Pillar getting 15 votes. Of course, one of the MVP finalists, makes sense that it would get a lot of votes. And was joined by its two teammates, Heatran and Iron Hand. So, Sky Pillar, top 3 seed, 3 Mons in the All-Star game. Pretty good. Azumarill of Big Bluff got 11 votes, joining its teammate Walking Wake, which also got 11 votes. Dragapult was one of 3 Mons for Rose Tower that ended up making it to the All-Star game, Pult getting 11 votes itself. Joined by Masquerada, who had 16, and Ladios, who had 18 and a half. Yes, you do see that number correctly. There were half votes. Those were the spectator votes this season. Ladios ended up getting more votes than any individual Pokemon to make the All-Star game, so congrats to Ladios. Is that a sign of what the MVP race resulted in? Only time will tell. IceQ of Haoli surprisingly making it in with 11 and a half votes. Remember that IceQ didn't actually play until the second half of the season, but did well enough in that back half that it got enough votes to make it in. Hippowdon was one of 3 Lavender Town Mons to make the All-Star game, so Lavender Town, as well as the other 2 top 3 seeds in the Ruby League, ended up putting 3 Mons in the All-Star game. Hippowdon with 10 and a half votes, Necrozma with 16 and a half votes, and Oricorio Pow with 12 and a half votes. Meloetta of Coraway, the MVP finalist, ended up getting 17 and a half votes as the only member of the workers to make it in. And then finally, Anastar's lone All-Star was Thunderous Therian, who did not have a good back half of the season, but was strong enough in the first half to get 9 votes and make it in. As we move over to the Sapphire side of things, we start with Barrascuda of Humalao, had 8.5 votes, just barely made the cutoff, got the least amount of votes of any All-Star this season, and joined its teammate and MVP finalist Jolteon, who had 16 and a half votes, which was the most out of any Mon in the Sapphire League. Titan was one of 3 Little Time Zone Bandits to make the All-Star game this time around, getting 9 votes, joining Tauros Paldean and Aqua, who had 10, and Veluza with 13 and a half. Veluza, one of those Mons that didn't see any playing time in the first half, but man, was it a force to be reckoned with in the second half. Darkrai of Spear Pillar got 12 votes, joining 3 of its teammates, Spear Pillar being the only team to have 4 All-Stars in the All-Star game. The aforementioned Darkrai, Great Tusk, who had 9 votes, Oricorio Bile, who also had 9 votes, and Tornadus Therian, who had 14 and a half. Infernape of the Hard Home Heaters was their lone All-Star, getting 9.5 votes. Iron Valiant of Mauville getting 14 votes, joining its teammate Lycanroc Dusk, who had 15 votes. Latias of Mount Steel getting 12.5, so despite the disappearing act by the team in the back half of the season, Latias still did well enough in the first half to get those All-Star votes. And then lastly, you've got Raikou, the lone All-Star for Goldenrod, getting 14 votes. Unfortunately, not every team has the fortune to get an all-star in most seasons, and this season, that meant that Kitakami and Castelia City both did not produce a single all-star. Granted, those were the two worst teams in the league as far as win-loss were concerned, so it makes sense that if there were any teams that wouldn't have all-stars, it would be those two. And it's not to say that they weren't even close, because Raging Bolt and Entei were both the first Mons that got cut off from the all-star process. And of course, it would be remiss if we didn't actually talk about the All-Star game at least a little bit. Obviously, it's a celebration of the season and a chance for the top two teams in the league to kick back and run some absolute nonsense, right? That's what the All-Star game is about. Yes, we are honoring the Pokemon that did the best over the course of the season, but you want to see some absolute buffoonery. SD Oricorio, Parasong, Meloetta. You see, the Ruby League All-Star has 5 Mons on the screen as opposed to a normal 6 because Nico just wanted to be cheeky. That's what it's all about. Explosion. Azelf coming in on the Terra Steel Latios that has +2 attack because it was weakness policy. Here you've got Booster Energy Defense Iron Valiant. Like, when are you going to see these type of sets over the course of an actual season? You're not going to, because there's just no sense in doing that, right? But the All-Star game, the perfect opportunity to showcase exactly what all these Mons can do, even if they're not exactly great, right? And you can see as the All-Star game went late into the set, some real nonsense. Special attacking Tauros Paldean Blaze with a Pataya Berry on top. But the big one came in Game 8, where Meloetta of Koroway presses Relic Song and then Giga Impact in pirouette form. And eventually the Ruby League All-Stars would in fact claim victory thanks to one last IQ Ice Spinner. So, Ruby League ended up winning 5-3, another fun All-Star game. Ice Q the MVP with 5 KOs, 10 total points. Latios had 5 KOs, Meloetta had 5 KOs, and Ruby League has now won 3 straight All-Star contests. Very fun. Oh, and also there was the Coaches Cup, I guess. Like, Will and AZ did play. There was an exhibition. It wasn't really much of nothing. Will won. Like, it happened. Sure. Alright, well, with the fun stuff out of the way, let's get into the big picture of today's episode. Playoff set recaps. 8 sets, of course. 2 wild cards, 4 league semis, 2 league finals to determine who are the final 2 teams standing. We said coming into this playoffs, it was wide open. Any of the top 6 teams could make it through. But of course, you know the playoffs are home to wild things, and all it takes is a little bit of momentum for one of those wild card teams to pull off a real run. So let's see who will be represented in the NWBA finals in season 8. So here we go. We start with the Sapphire Wildcard, Goldenrod and Little Root winning the regular season series, including that big Week 6 Super Saturday set. Tauros Paldean Aqua out the gate goes for a CC on Gastron, does a healthy chunk. Gastron puts up the rocks and then goes into Dragonite to take the next few moves. And you know what the name of the game is for Dragonite. Dragon Dance Sweeping, that's what we want to do. So it gets up to +1 as Swampert comes in. EQ does about 40%. Swampert goes for the knockoff, takes the second EQ, and then flip turns out. So it doesn't put up any hazards, but it's going to allow Low Kicks to come in and potentially shut down this D-Knight. But Low Kicks does not go for the first impression, so D-Knight gets off a huge E-Speed. And thanks to the Life Orb from Low Kicks, both Mons are going to end up going down here. So, Yacha Speed comes in, does 70% to a Raikou thanks to its own Life Orb, but it's not enough to knock Raikou out of substitute range, so it's going to require a second Psycho Boost to pop the sub, and Raikou is going to take advantage of that and pick up the KO with a Thunderbolt after the DO Speed takes more Life Orb recoil. So Tauros Paldean Aqua comes back in, but this allows Gastro to come in to block the Aqua Jet that was necessary to hit the faster Raikou. So this allows Gastrodon to pick up a KO on Swampert with the Earth Power after going for an Insurance Terra Fairy just in case the Tauros was not choiced. Alolan Ninetales comes in, takes rocks damage, puts up the Veil, gets hit with an Earth Power, and then reveals that it's a eject button, so this allows Veluza to come in and get the party started. This has been Littleroot's breadwinner in the entire back half of the season. So you see the Filet Away, and you see the Citrus Berry come through. But the Slitherwing has Mirror Herb, so now Veluza is in a much more precarious situation, has to Terra Water to live the first impression, pick up that KO with the Psycho Cut, but all that means is that it's in range for a Mienshao Fake Out to pick up the KO, so Goldenrod at a huge disadvantage here. Charles Paldean Aqua, the only offensive presence left, and while the CC does a nice 34% to Gastro, it looks like it's going to be a 2-hit KO. But the second CC does not kill. AZ gets the low roll. Charles Paldean goes down to the Gastro Earth Power, so it's all up to an Alolan Ninetales, which has to take even more Rocks Chip. And even though it gets up the Veil, the last Earth Power is going to crit anyway. And so Goldenrod picks up the wild card victory, avenges their 2 regular season losses to Littleroot. Dom finally gets his long-awaited first career playoff series win in the wild card victory over the Time Zone Bandits. Now we've got the Ruby League wildcard. Corway and Big Bluff split the season series. Corway won their more recent matchup, so it looks to be fairly even. And out the gate, you see what the game plan is for the workers. Yuxi's going to come in, put up some screens, and then trade rocks with Torkoal to get some nice hazards up and get things going with an early advantage. Garchomp comes in on a Torkoal Lava Plume and does get burned, unfortunately, but the Garchomp does have a Lumberry at its disposal. But knowing that they don't want to risk another burn, Corway goes back into Milotic as Donphan comes in. And it looks like Milotic's going to have a great matchup here, especially behind the screens. That's called doing a lot. But on turn 9, Donphan reveals that it's got Endeavor. So Milotic flip turns out, meaning that it's going to go down to Rocks the next time it comes in. And so it's up to Yuxi to pick up the KO on Donphan after that sneaky surprise. Torkoal comes back in to put the sun back up. You see that it's not boots, it is in fact Heat Rock, so it's going to give Big Bluff the maximum amount of time to get their sun offense going. But a great knock from Yuxi means that Venusaur is going to be without its Life Orb. And then of course Yuxi having screens means that Light Screen is going to be able to come out and protect Meloetta from even a +4 Venusaur after the second growth. You see the Terra Ground to stop Psyshock from one-shotting, but that Giga Drain isn't doing nearly enough to take out Meloetta. So, smartly, Corway goes into Milotic, sacks it to the rocks to get Cinderace in, leave Meloetta a little healthy, and Cinderace is going to pick up that KO with the Sucker Punch. Notably, it is not Libero, it is in fact Blaze. On the next turn, Cinderace goes for another Sucker Punch, expecting a flip turn, but instead Wake goes just straight for the Hydro Steam, picks up the KO on Cinderace. So Gengar comes in, but because it's booster special attack, that means a Scarf Gengar is going to outspeed a Scarf Wake. So Corway now up to a huge advantage. Both of Big Bluff's Sun Sweepers are now down for the count. Azu goes for the knock instead of going straight for the belly drum. That's going to allow Yuxi to put up a screen and get a little bit of extra chip on Azu before going down to a knockoff. So Garchomp comes in behind the Reflect, and because it's faster, Azu's got to go straight for the Aqua Jet, and it's not going to do nearly enough before going down to an Earthquake. So Corway now opens up a 3-2 lead. The Sun Sweepers are down. Azu is down. It's looking like it's going to be curtains for the Bisharp season as Torkoal goes down to an EQ. It's all up to Several Edge, which reveals one last trick, Endure, so it lives the EQ, procs the weak armor, and procs the weakness policy on top of that. So Bitterblade's gonna pick up the KO on Garchomp. The healing comes first before the rough skin, so Several Edge is gonna live. Gengar comes in. It doesn't have Sucker or Shadow Sneak or anything like that because it's not a physical attacker. It goes down to the Bitterblade, and Meloetta at 38%, it's not gonna be able to live a +2 Bitterblade. And so from the jaws of defeat, Big Bluff turns it around, picks up the wild card victory thanks to Sarah Legion's great late game comeback. And in a matchup between two GMs that got to the playoffs for the first time in their career, it's Keith that emerges victorious and moves on. So we move into the meat of the playoffs, Ruby League semis, Lavender Town and Big Bluff. The Pranksters very easily dispatched of the Bisharps in both of their regular season matchups, so Big Bluff a huge underdog coming into the set, trying to find any opportunity they can to set up and end things early, but of course Hippowdon's got Whirlwind, so Azumarill wastes that Belly Drum Citrus Berry opportunity. But at the very least, Big Bluff does pull Venusaur from that Whirlwind. Giga Drains on the incoming Kieran, reveals that it is in fact Standard Life Orb, and then Terra Fires to try to read an ice move, but the Kieran is sub-protect, so it scouts out the Sludge Bomb, and it's going to get some big damage with the Earth Power. Not enough to KO, but is enough to take down Venusaur after the Life Orb recoil, so Kieran trades into Venusaur. Turn 11. Suicune finds an opportunity in, and you know that this thing is going to be a pain in the ass to deal with. Eventually gets a Scald Burn on Azumarill, but because it's not behind the sub, Azu at the very least able to knock off the lefties. And so on turn 19, Suicune, out of HP for a substitute, picks up the KO on Azumarill after finding a single Calm Mind, which proves to be very crucial because the Psy Noise from the Espeon does not pick up the KO, so Scald is going to do a lot of damage to this Espeon, which is in fact lefties. Suicune eventually going down to the Psy Noise, but thanks to the chip, Scarf Rotom Watch is able to come in and pick up the KO on Espeon with that Hydro Pump. So now it's Bishop's turn to try to find a setup opportunity. Hippowdon comes in, Bishop goes straight for the Swords Dance, and then goes for the Iron Head, which does not pick up the KO on Hippo, but surprisingly, Hippowdon goes for a Whirlwind instead of trying to pick up the KO with the Earthquake, so Hippowdon goes down. Torkoal gets drawn, allows Iron Moth to come in and go straight for an Agility. You see that's Booster Special Attack, and in the sun, its Fire move is going to do so much more damage, so it's able to pick up the KO on Torkoal, which does not have a ground move. Bishop has to come in and go for a Sucker Punch, which doesn't KO, but a big mistake here from Lavender Town. Iron Moth greedily going for a Fire Blast instead of a fire move that's sure to hit, and so Bishop is able to pick up the KO after trying to play some Sucker Punch games. Moth goes down, Rotom Wash goes straight for the Trick, which does pay off because the Bishop tried to find an opportunity to SD, so it forces Walking Wake in, takes some damage from the Volt Switch. Cinccino comes in, but Walking Wake is in fact Scarf, so that Scarf Draco is going to pick up the KO on Cinccino. Rotom Wasp is forced to come in. Bishop is available to get sacked. Gets burnt, that's not going to matter. It's all about getting just a little bit more chip, and it doesn't matter at the end of the day because we know that the Walking Wake is Scarfed anyway. So even though Rotom Wasp tries its best, gets Bishop down to burn KO range, and even tricks back its own Choice Scarf, Walking Wake, who we know is faster, is going to pick up that KO with the Draco Meteor, and so Big Buff ends up taking game 1. Game 2, Suicune the lead out the gate, and this thing causes so many issues for Big Bluff in game 2. Gets behind the sub immediately, and eventually on turn 16, even a +3 Venusaur isn't able to take out Suicune, thanks to it being able to pressure stall Venusaur out of Giga Drains. And then you see that it has sub, obviously. Clear Smog does not go through the substitute, so eventually Suicune's able to pick up the KO on Bisharp after burning it behind sub at +4. Azumarill comes in, not only gets burned, but gets hit with a critical hit, so it procs the Citrus Berry on top of it, tries to Belly Drum up, but it's already burnt. It's at 6%. It's not going to be able to do much of anything. Suicune, of course, able to protect and get as much leftovers back as possible. And after the burn KO, Big Bluff just straight up forfeits. So a huge turnaround in game 2 for the Pranksters. Game 3, Iron Moth in early on Torkoal, gets off big damage thanks to that Sludge Wave. Torkoal, Clear Smog at the very least able to clear the Agility, but it's already looking dire for the Bisharps. Iron Moth gets a +2 back up with Agility, and has Dazzling Gleam, but does not get the roll, so Walking Wake picks up the KO with the Hydro Steam. Some very unfortunate luck here for Lavender Town in some very crucial circumstances, but a big misstep here. Walking Wake stays in on the Suicune, which immediately gets up a Calm Mind. And we've seen these games before, we know how it's gonna go. Bishop goes down on turn 13 to a burn, Suicune already up to +3. And so while Azumarill is able to knock off the leftovers eventually and keep Suicune low, it's also going to go down to Suicune before Espeon finally takes the Demon out to keep this a 4-4 game in game 3. Cinccino comes in, but crucially it's Adamant, and then the side noise crits anyway. So once again, a huge swing as far as the RNG is concerned for the Bisharps. Torkoal comes in on a Hippowdon Earthquake, goes down, but this allows Walking Wake to come in and get off some huge damage. Rotom Wasp is going to have to take a hit, but it's Hydro Steam and not Draco, so Rotom doesn't go down here. Hippowdon's able to switch back in, and even though Walking Wake's going to do a ton of damage, it does at the very least put up the sand to KO Walking Wake. So Venusaur is going to have to come in. Giga Drains takes care of the Hippowdon, which allows Kieran to get in freely against Venusaur. We saw this interaction in Game 1. We know that the Kieran has Substitute and Protect, so it's going to be able to stall out and scout out Venusaur, get some nice chip thanks to Life Orb and the Sandstorm. Terrifier once again from the Venusaur, but Kieran protects to able to scout that out. And so on turn 28, Earth Power does pick up the KO on Venusaur. Sandstorm runs out, so it's all up to Espeon, but we've seen this thing is faster with leftovers, and it has Calm Mind. So it's going to be able to easily take the Freeze Drive. And it has Draining Kiss, so it's going to be able to stay at a very healthy percent, even in front of a Kieran. And so it's looking like Lavender Town is at their wits' end. Kieran tries to protect, but we know that it's slower, so it goes down to a Draining Kiss. It's all up to Scarf Rodom to try to get a crit on the Hydro Pump, and misses for good measure anyway. And so Big Bluff pulls off one of the great upsets in the history of the NWBA, wins 2-1. Big day for Espeon. Suicune's 9 kills, 19 points, not enough. Nico's White Whale once again eludes him as Big Buff becomes just the 6th team in NWBA history to advance to League Finals after playing in the Wild Card. Ruby Semis Part 2, Rose Tower and Sky Pillar. Sky Pillar won the regular season series 2-0, so despite being the lower seeded seed, they actually have an advantage here. Early on, Porygon Z, the lead, gets off a Nasty Plot, gets good damage off on Heatran, which unfortunately misses the Magma Storm. But then Tri-Attack freezes on the second instance, so Heatran, not able to thaw out in time, eventually goes down to a Porygon Z Tri-Attack. So great start here for Rose Tower. Qualmont tries to revenge KO with the CC, but the PZ has a Chople Berry. You know that Rose Tower has been using those Resistance Berries so often this season. And so Palmont goes down. It's a very early lead for the Copperajah before Manaphy finally picks up the KO with the Surf. Meowscarada comes in, Iron Hands takes a Flower Trick, and it does 43%, a huge chunk of damage on a very physically bulky Mon. Tells you that Meowscarada is most likely banned here. So you see the Volt Switch into the Hydreigon, which is likely Scarfed, U-turns out on the Fez into Manaphy. But Meowscarada is able to come in and block that Psychic. So very good swap here from Rose Tower. Sylveon has to come in, take a Flower Trick, and it does 69%. So this is definitely a bounded Meowscarada to be able to do this much damage to bulky mons like Iron Hands and Sylveon. Iron Hands goes down to the Flower Trick. Rose Tower now up 5-3, and it's looking like Game 1 is already wraps. But at the very least, Sky Pill is going to fight back. You see Earthquake actually coming out from the Hydreigon. Manaphy surfs on the switch. Zapdos G gets off 49% thanks to that Thunderous Kick. So Sylveon's gonna have to come in, takes 21%, does in fact have Rocky Helmet, so it's gonna get off some decent chip on the Zapdos before going down to a second Thunderous Kick. Manaphy comes back out. It is faster, KOs with the Surf, but is that a speed tie? We don't know for certain. Hydra tries to come in on the Meowscarada, but it has low kick, so Hydra goes down. Manaphy, the only mon left, has to go for a neutral move like Surf, which is of course resisted by Meowscarada, so it's not gonna get the win, but at the very least it does reveal that it is Scarf before Rose Tower secures the Game 1 victory. So we move to Game 2. Porygon Z once again the lead for Rose Tower. Iron Hands the lead for Sky Pillar, stays in on the Tri-Attack and gets off a huge amount of damage with that Heavy Slam, revealing that the Iron Hands is actually banded. Heatran comes in to take the Tri-Attack, and because PZ is already very low, Heatran doesn't have to risk a Magma Storm, gets the KO with the Earth Power here. So Zapdos G comes in, doubles into Fez. Heatran goes for the Protect, so at the very least it is able to get up rocks on Fezandipity, but this is not your normal Fezandipity. Swords Dance comes out, and then Technician boosted double kick is just enough to pick up the KO on Heatran. Seeing some wild tech come out here in the playoffs. But because the Pheasantipity is not defensive, a Terra Electric double shot from Pokémon is able to one-shot. So it forces Tauros to have to come in. Sylveon, we've already seen, has Rocky Helmet, and because it is fully physically defensive, it's gonna force enough recoil between Rocky Helmet, Life Orb Tip, and the Flare Blitz Tip for Tauros to go down to its own moves after taking out the Sylveon. So Zapdos G, Manaphy both come in. Zapdos G has to leave, thinking that this Manaphy is actually just regularly Scarfed, but knowing it has the moves to take out Zapdos. Mesprit comes in, doubles into Zapdos G. So Skypillar is going to have to sack something. Iron Hands is the choice. Zapdos gets off the KO with that close combat, but that allows Manaphy to come back in. Mesprit is the switch in. Manaphy reads that, goes straight for the U-turn, does proc the Citrus Berry, but it allows Palmont to come in, threaten with double shock, so Masquerada has to be the answer. And a big critical hit comes through, means that Masquerada goes down to a double shock, so it forces Zapdos G to have to come back in, picks up the KO with the close combat, but we already know that this thing doesn't want to stay in on the Manaphy. So Mesprit has to be the sack, goes down after a couple surfs from the Manaphy. So it's all up to Zapdos G. And because Skypillar is up in the sack war, it can safely sacrifice the Hydreigon to a Thunderous Kick to allow Manaphy to come in and pick up the KO with the Psychic for Skypillar to answer back in Game 2. Game 3, Porygon Z once again the lead for Rose Tower, Manaphy the lead for Skypillar, so able to U-turn out into Heatran, take the Tri-Attack very easily. Porygon Z goes for the nasty plot, trying to get off as much damage on Heatran as possible, takes the Magma Storm, and then dropping it all on the line, Hyper Beam comes out from Porygon Z, does a huge amount of damage to Heatran, but wisely Skypillar able to get up rocks before picking up the KO with the Earth Power. And so Tauros, Paldean Blaze has to come in. And a big play here from Rose Tower, Terras, and then calls out the bluff. Earthquakes on the Heatran to pick up the KO. So it forces Hydreigon to come in, which is also likely Scarf, as we have assumed throughout the set. U-turns out on Zapdos G to allow Sylveon to get in. And then Sylveon actually reveals Reflect. We know that Skypillar likes bringing one or both screens to their set, so it allows Iron Hands to come in on the Fez SD, get off a lot of damage on Mesprit thanks to that banded Heavy Slam. But Mesprit also has Reflect, so it's not going to be quite that simple for Skypillar in this Game 3. Tauros comes in to easily take the Heavy Slam, so it does take some Rocks Chip, but it's in a good position, and then doubles back out into Pheasantipity on the incoming Sylveon. So Rose Tower finds another opportunity to get off a Swords Dance, this time on Iron Hands. Poliwrath not enough to KO Iron Hands, but the Heavy Slam crucially does not pick up the KO on Pheasantipity either. So Double Kick comes out, not wanting the chance to miss. Iron Hands goes down, Rose Tower in a very slight lead. Manaphy comes in, Tauros, Paldean Blaze is in, available to get sacked. Manaphy U-turns out into Hydreigon, which forces a KO with the Draco Meteor, revealing that the Hydra is in fact Scarf once and for all. Meowscarada comes in, so something's got to get sacked on Skypillar's side once again. The answer is Sylveon. Takes a couple Flower Tricks and goes down, which allows Hydreigon to come back in. Pheasantipity gets sacked to a potential U-turn, but it's actually Draco Meteor. So Zapdos G comes in knowing that it can live one, and it is in fact Adamant Scarf, so it's slower than the Hydreigon, which gets off a massive amount of damage before going down to the close combat. So Manaphy is going to be able to come in, pick up the KO with the Alluring Voice. Mesprit has to come in. Skypillar switches out into Palmont. Mesprit looking for an answer, goes straight for the Healing Wish, puts it all on the back of Meowscarada, but the Palmont has Mach Punch to do more than enough chip to put Meowscarada in range of Manaphy. It doesn't matter if the Flower Trick one-shots the Palmont. The Scarf Manaphy is in fact going to be able to pick up the final KO with the U-turn. And so after one of the greatest sets we've seen in NWBA history, Skypillar pulls off the season sweep of Rose Tower. Manaphy, 7 KOs in the Master Performance as Vasser moves 6-3 all-time in playoff sets and advances to Ruby League Finals. We now move to Sapphire semis. Mauville and Humalau split the season series. Humalau getting the better of them in the more recent matchup. So this is one of the most even matchups heading into the playoffs. And it took a bit of a while for things to get going here. Turn 7, you see Hatterene finally goes down to Zapdos after a combination of a Reuniclus, Future Sight, and a Hurricane. But on turn 11, Reuniclus that was fully parried after a Hatterene Nuzzle goes down to a knockoff. So some early back and forths. You see that Humalau is in fact using Screen Zamazenta. Roar pulls Reversion, which goes straight for the shift gear. But the Haxorus has a Mirror Herb, and behind the screens, this thing is going to be a lot more of a pain to deal with. EQ comes out, crits the Reversion straight up. So Terra or no Terra, Reversion goes down. And then Haxorus finds the opportunity to Dragon Dance after Terra grounding right in front of the Zapdos. So Dragon Claw comes out, barely misses out on the KO. Zapdos able to U-turn out into Crawdaunt. And Haxorus, having to respect a Banded Aqua Jet, goes in the Toxicroak, which easily takes it thanks to the Dry Skin ability. Finds an opportunity to SD, and because it's faster than a defensive Zapdos, gets the KO with the Gunk Shot. So now Flygon has to come out. Sucker Punch does a lot of damage. Flygon picks up the KO with the Earthquake, but reveals that it's also Life Orb, so it's not faster than a Jolteon, which is able to pick up the KO with Alluring Voice. So Humalau up to a nice 4-2 lead. Crawdaunt picks up the KO with the Aqua Jet. Caesar comes in. But here comes Iron Valiant. Takes the U-turn. Caesar goes into Zamazenta, which is already chipped. So a Moonblast more than enough to pick up the KO on Zamazenta. So Caesar has to come back in and scare it out with Bullet Punch. But Salame reads it, goes into Crawdaunt, takes another Bullet Punch, goes straight for the Aqua Jet, which very crucially gets a critical hit. Otherwise, this could have been a roll, and there was an opportunity for Caesar to pick up the win with the Bullet Punch. Instead, it's Crawdaunt picking up the win with its own priority moves as Mauville takes game 1. Go to game 2. Toxicroak gets in behind screens, knocks off the Reuniclus, and then Terra Darks goes straight for the SD on a Future Sight. Zapdos has to come in, and a +2 Gunk Shot is enough to pick up the Oko on Zapdos. So Flygon has to come in. Hatterene, which is bold, comes in on the Flygon DD. Easily takes the Future Sight behind the Light Scream. U-turn does a healthy amount, but because Hatterene is Rocky Helmet, Flygon's going to take a lot of chip on the way out. Hatterene going to be able to heal a decent amount thanks to that Draining Kiss. Toxicroak comes in as Reuniclus goes for a Shadow Ball. So thanks to that Terra, something else has to take a Gunk Shot. And Iron Valiant is not the answer you want to that question. Goes straight down. So the biggest threat on Mauville's side goes down. Hatterene comes back in, is able to live the EQ, so it goes down to the U-turn, but Flygon takes a lot of chip thanks to 2 turns of Life Orb Recoil and the Rocky Helmet. Zoroark comes in, gets scared out by the Caesar, who goes straight for the Bullet Punch. Reuniclus then Terra Waters on the second Bullet Punch, goes straight for the Shadow Ball, which doesn't do a whole lot of damage to the Caesar, but at the very least gives it some sort of recourse. But of course that means it's a lot more susceptible to Jolteon, who goes straight for the Thunderbolt, which is blocked by Flygon, but because the Flygon is Life Orb, it goes down to the ensuing Alluring Voice. So now Zoroark comes in. Kobe, paying attention, knows it's a Zoroark, gets off the Volt Switch, does a lot of damage, and Zoroark's Shadow Ball only doing very little chip to a Zamazenta, which it tricked Specs onto earlier. Crawdaunt gets pulled on a Roar, knocks off the Specs, Zamazenta going for the Roar again, and because Kobe just decided to Roar Shuffle, gets rewarded after getting knocked off, is able to put up screens, and then willingly sacrifices itself to a combination of U-turn and Future Sight just to keep the momentum on his side. Very high level play coming out here. So Caesar is able to get off a big U-turn, which crits for good measure, goes into Jolteon, and because it's behind screens, we get to play the Volt Turn game. Volt Switch takes out Reuniclus. Toxicroak comes in, knowing that the Future Sight is on the way. Sucker Punch on the Zoroark. Again, Kobe paying attention to the HP values on the other side of the screen. Takes out Zoroark. And then Gunk Shot doing more than enough chip for Crawdaunt to go down to Jolteon after picking up the KO with the CC. So Humalau expertly battles back and takes game 2 of the set. So we move to the rubber match. Jolteon volt switching out on Reuniclus after a few turns of positioning. Reuniclus gets off a knock on Scizor to remove the choice band, which is going to be crucial. Scizor is going to U-turn out on a chipped Zapdos into Toxicroak. We already know things don't want to take this gunk shot. Zapdos has to be the unfortunate recipient and goes down there. Flygon comes in. Zamazenta is the swap. Takes 48% from an EQ because it's already used as Dauntless Shield, but because it's faster, gets off a Reflect. And then lives the +1 Earthquake to do a lot of damage back to Flygon with that close combat. So Flygon is able to pick up the KO on Zamazenta, but not before going down to 2 HP. And then revealing that it's actually 4th move Quick Attack for good measure, just to get a little bit more chip on Scizor before it goes down to its own Life Orb recoil. The Zoroark is actually the switch. Presses Flamethrower, catches Scizor lacking, but because this thing is choiced, it allows Haxorus to come in and go straight for a DD. Valiant has to be the swap. It is booster speed, so it's gonna force Haxorus out here, but it goes for the Encore instead of trying to go for chip on the Toxicroak. So Toxicroak was able to go for a gunk shot, but crucially misses. Zoroark was actually the swap, and then tricks the Life Orb as Toxicroak misses another gunk shot. Gets off a lot of damage with that Flamethrower, but Gunk Shot does land this time and poisons the Zoroark for good measure, which did not pick up the KO because it was Life Orb and not Specs anymore. But Life Orb is enough to take out the Hatterene. Goes down in one hit. Zoroark is now severely chipped, so Jolteon is going to be able to come in, get off a good hit. Thunderbolt straight into Reuniclus, which is AV but does get parried. So Jolteon is able to Volt Switch into Haxorus. Takes the Shadow Ball, unfortunately gets the drop, but Haxorus is going to be able to live the next one. And the Reuniclus gets fully parried for good measure. So Dragon Claw picks up the KO on Reuniclus. Valiant's already used its booster. It's going to go down in one hit to an Iron Head. It's all on the back of Crawdaunt, which does not go down to a Dragon Claw, but because it has to go for the knockoff and not the Aqua Jet, Jolteon's going to be able to come in, pick up the KO with the Thunderbolt, and a severely damaged Zoroark, which is already slower, is in no way, shape, or form going to be able to live. And so Humelau, in another well-fought, great set, advances to the second consecutive League Finals appearance for the swim team. Jolteon, another massive performance. Salami played great in their first playoff appearance, but wasn't enough to overcome Kobe, whose 7th career playoff win now ties the all-time record in the NWBA. Spear Pillar and Goldenrod for the other Sapphire semis matchup. Spear Pillar dominated the regular season matchup, so it was going to be an uphill battle for Goldenrod, and Golurk was going to be a big part of this matchup if they were going to pull off the upset. Getting off a huge knockoff on Tornadus Therian after the crit, getting some good damage off in Superior, and then Terra Darking immediately to make the knockoffs that much stronger. Superior obviously scouting the Golurk, figuring that this thing is likely AV because why else would it stay in on a Superior, especially when you look at how much damage it's doing. But Will-O-Wisp Darkrai is able to come through, get off a big burn on Golurk, and keep this thing in check for the remainder of the battle. Oricorio is able to come in on the EQ. It immediately Terra Fairies and gets the business. Golurk goes straight for the knockoff just to remove the boots, but this is going to be difficult for Goldenrod to get out of this hole. Astrodon comes in, takes 44% from a Hurricane, and while it does live the second one, it is going to get confused here. They're able to break out once and get off a recover. Breaks out a second time and reveals that it's Clear Smog, so at the very least it's going to stop Oricorio from immediately destroying the rest of this team. Breaks out of confusion a third time to get off another Clear Smog, so Oricorio is going to have to go straight for the Roost. That's when the confusion ends for Gastro, which goes straight for the recover. And so Oricorio is going to have to leave after losing that 1v1 versus the Gastro for the time being. Superior forces a switch out into Mienshao, which takes a lot of damage, not enough to KO. And then Spear Pillar makes the call, decides that Mienshao can't be Scarfed. It is, in fact, not Scarfed. So Superior takes out Mienshao. Slitherwing comes in, U-turns on the Protect for Superior. So, Spear Pillar goes back into Tornadus, takes a lot of damage thanks to rocks, and a big U-turn from a Slitherwing that is likely Adamant Scarfed. Bleak Windstorm comes out on the Dragonite, which does in fact lower its speed, So while Dragonite is able to pick up the KO with the extreme speed on the Tornadus, it can't get off a more impactful hit on Oricorio outside of the extreme speed, which won't be nearly enough to KO before it goes down to a Revelation Dance. So Spirit Pillar up 5-4. Raikou, already severely chipped thanks to Big Blissey, comes in, and again, Big Blissey able to deter Raikou from doing much of anything in this matchup. Slewing has to come in, and while it does dodge a T-Wave, forcing Darkrai to have to come in and get sacked to a Slitherwing U-turn, it just prolongs the battle just a little bit longer. Raikou comes in now down to 20%. Blissey comes back in. Golurk has to come in as Blissey gets back up to full thanks to that soft boil. Slowking is the swap on an EQ, and because the Golurk is burned, it's not going to do much of anything to this. And the Slowking has a Cobra Berry for good measure, so even a knockoff from a Terra Golurk isn't going to do much of anything, especially because it's burnt. Oricorio is able to come in. Gastrodon has to come back out. Oricorio roosts up, forcing Slitherwing to have to be the answer to the expecting Quiver Dance, but Hurricane instead comes out, and from there, Goldenrod just forfeits, not wanting to try to win what feels like a losing battle to Oricorio. So we go to game 2. Darkrai gets off an early Will-O-Wisp on Mienshao, which is in fact Lumberry, but because the Darkrai is faster, it does leave the Mienshao burnt anyway. So Darkrai takes the CC quite comfortably, protects just to get a little bit more chip damage in, and so you expect both sides to swap out after this turn. Oricorio comes in, Samurott does as well. Oricorio Terra Fairies on the Scarf Samurott flip turn, goes into Golurk on the Quiver Dance, but because this is a Golurk that is a V, the Poltergeist is going to do still a decent amount of damage, and Golurk's going to be able to stay in front of this thing for a little bit longer. So Darkrai has to come in. Golurk reads that, gets off the EQ, takes care of Darkrai, so Superior has to come out. Protects on the first turn, just to get a little bit more HP back. Again, this is AV Golurk, so it's going to be able to take a couple of Leaf Storms from a Superior. First Leaf Storm does 30. Knockoff does a healthy chunk to Superior, and the second Leaf Storm doesn't KO either. So Golurk's able to pick up the KO on Superior. Goldenrod gets up to a 6-4 lead. In comes the Honorable Great Tusk. Booster attack gets off the Rapid Spin to pick up the KO on Golurk. Now it's at +1 speed. This thing can be a problem. Rapid Spins again on the next turn to make sure that it outspeeds Dragonite at +1 and reveals Ice Spitter as coverage to take that mon out. And that's the set. Goldenrod once again deciding that it's not worth trying to fight what looks to be a losing battle. And so their struggles against Spirit Pillar end up ruining their season as well, as the Stratagems pull off their second career League Finals appearance for Galarian Blades, moving on to Sapphire Finals. So now we're down to 4 teams, Spear Pillar and Humalao, for the Sapphire League Championship. Humalao slight underdogs. They did get swept in the regular season by Spear Pillar, but early on were able to get off to a good advantage thanks to a Vileplume Terra, knock Arcanine all the way down to 4%, and then reads the Slowking switch on the next turn to get off a nice Toxic. And that Toxic would pay dividends pretty soon after. Conkeldurr coming in as Slowking tries to set up Future Sight, and thanks to Hatterene's Future Sight and that prior poison damage, Slowking is the first casualty of the set thanks to a Conkeldurr Facade. But of course this just means that Tornadus Theory can come in and cause all types of problems. Gets off a nice Bleak Wind on Scizor, and thanks to the Future Sight chip, Humalao content to just get off a Banded Scizor Bullet Punch before going down to a knockoff from Tornadus to make it 5-5. Chansey comes in, Tornadus U-turns out into Great Tusk, and you look at Humalao's team, there's not really a great answer to this demon. Headlong Rush easily able to take care of Hatterene, and so Conkeldurr is going to have to come in. Arcanine available to get sacked, does in fact go down to a Conkeldurr Drain Punch, so this thing stays knotted up at 4-4. So Grimmsnarl comes in here, and it's actually Bulk Up instead of the standard Screams Grimmsnarl that you normally see. And so Blades is going to try to use this thing as a setup sweeper. You see, because of that Prankster ability, it's going to be able to bulk up before any mon can move. Terra Fires, so that it's not immediately blown up by a Sludge Bomb, which does do a nice 39%, but Grimmsnarl has Rest at the ready. So this thing's gonna be able to stay relatively healthy, but it is gonna be a long, drawn-out battle because Vileplume also has Strength Sap on the other side. So even though Grimmsnarl does have Sleep Talk, and for good measure, Spirit Break as its attacking move, this is going to be a very slow-paced 1v1 between Vileplume and Grimmsnarl. So we move to turn 32. Basket Legion F comes in as Grimmsnarl goes for a rest. That's a good read on Humalau's side. And Grimmsnarl doesn't pull the Spirit Break, so it can't pick up the KO, and Basket Legion F picks up the KO on the other side with the Surf. Turn 38, Chansey goes down to a superior Leaf Storm. Conkeldurr comes in, goes for the Mach Punch, gets off good chip, but is also going to go down. So that leaves Basket Legion F and Vileplume. But that Basket Legion F is Scarfed. The Ice Beam, going to be enough to pick up the KO on Great Tusk. And you see, turn 41 is where Spirit Pillar finds out it's Scarf. So Tornadus Therian goes down, and Serperior has more than enough to get knocked out by that Ice Beam. So, Humalau is able to take the first game. Game 2, Chansey gets up box early, but that just gives an opportunity for Great Tusk to come in. Gets off a lot of damage with that Headlong Rush, and because there isn't really a great switch into this Mon, Chansey has to go down after another. So Basket Legion F comes in. Tornadus Therian comes in to make sure Great Tusk doesn't get popped, and while it does take a ton of damage from that Surf, Slowking is bulky enough as a resist to be able to take quite a few Surfs. So Hatterene has to come in. Slowking sets up the Future Sight, and then goes for a Chile Reception to get on out of there. Arcanine comes in, as Hatterene goes for its own Future Sight, and then Terra Normal straight for the Flare Blitz does a ton of damage to Hatterene, but Psyshock is enough to pick up the KO after the recoil. Of course, the Future Sight set up by Slowking means that Hatterene also goes down, so it keeps Spirit Pillar in the slight lead. Tornadus, not wanting to go down to a Bandit Teaser or Bullet Punch, goes into Slowking, but Humalau gets that read, goes straight for the knockoff, takes out Slowking, which does allow Tornadus to come back in and get off some big damage on something coming in. But it goes straight for the Heat Wave, so Basket Legion easily takes that, foot turns back out into Scizor. Tornadus stays in though, gets off the knockoff, and then takes the Bullet Punch easily because it's no longer choice, and picks up the KO with the Bleak Wind Storm. Basket Legion comes back in, and Blissey was the game 2 swap for Grimmsnarl, so you know this thing's gonna be able to sit in front of Basket Legion F for quite some time. Conkeldurr gets brought in off the foot turn. Something's gonna take a Facade. It's Great Tusk's turn, which does live the Facade, but it's not gonna live the Mach Punch right after, so Great Tusk goes down. We remain tied up at 3. Tornadus comes in. Something's gonna go down to a Bleak Wind Storm. It's Vileplume's turn. This allows Basket Legion F to come back out. Serperior comes in, but it's Ice Beam, so Serperior takes a ton of damage. And Spirit Pillar content to let Serperior go, rewarding Humalau for that read. So Blissey can come in as healthy as possible. And it's actually Psychic, so it does a ton of damage to this Conkeldurr, and it outpaces it, so Conkeldurr goes down to 2 Psychics. If that second Psychic did not kill, Blissey would have went down, and Basket Legion F could have won the set right then and there, but instead, this somewhat offensive Blissey is able to take out Conkeldurr, easily withstand the barrage of Surfs from Basket Legion F, and so after just a few Shadow Balls, Blissey is able to turn the tide of the set completely and pick up the Game 2 win for Spirit Pillar's season to remain alive. So we go to the rubber match. Arcanine and Jolteon the leads in Game 3. Jolteon the swap for Vileplume. Arcanine immediately terrors as Jolteon just Volt Switches out of there. Chansey comes in, takes about 50% from a Flare Blitz, and then goes into Basket Legion on the double to ensure that Arcanine goes down to the recoil damage, Basket Legion F not really needing that HP. So Basket Legion F flip turns out on the Tentacle, which was the swap in Game 3, which reveals that it's Swords Dance, but not wanting to risk not being able to KO the Chansey, just goes into Blissey. A few turns later, Great Tusk is able to get in and start bulking up after spitting away the rocks on Chansey, pops it with a close combat, so it forces Scizor to have to come in, and again, one more time, Great Tusk doesn't really have a good answer from Humalau, so Scizor goes down after a Bullet Punch, forces Conkeldurr to come in, does not pick up the KO with Mach Punch, so that means Conkeldurr is going to have to take a ton of chip thanks to the headlong rush before finally taking out Great Tusk with the 3rd straight priority move. This allowed Tornadus Therian to come back in and take very little from that Mach Punch before taking out Conkeldurr to keep Spear Pillar in the lead 4-3. Jolteon comes in. Slowking is the response, expecting a Volt Switch, but instead, Jolteon is Calm Mind, so it picks up the KO on Slowking the next turn with that T-Bolt. So it forces Tentacruel in, which goes for the Protect, and so it means that Jolteon's going to get off a big Thunderbolt, but it doesn't pick up the KO, and the Tentacruel extremely crucially gets a poison off of the Gunk Shot on Jolteon. So now Jolteon is going to get down to one more turn. Huge momentum swing here for the Stratagems. Blissey able to come in, easily take the Volt Switch as Jolteon leaves, trying to get as many turns in as possible as it can. Forces Hatterene to come in. Shadow Ball comes out from Blissey, which immediately gets the Spadef drop. And so Hatterene's not going to be able to stay in front of this thing for as long as it wants to, thanks to that drop. It does have Mystical Fire to, at the very least, lower Blissey's special attack, but because of how specially bulky Blissey is, Hatterene isn't going to really be able to stay in front of this thing without going for Draining Kiss, which is going to heal a lot of HP for Hatterene. But Blissey, of course, has self-healing, so it's a matter of just weathering the storm of Hatterene. And then on turn 24, wisely, the Stratagems go into Tornadus Therian to take the Psyshock, so it forces something to have to go down here to a Bleak Windstorm. That answer is Basculegion F. Jolteon is able to come in because it's Boots, is able to get another turn. Volt switches back out into Hatterene, but we've already seen that this thing can't really stay in front of Blissey, even with Draining Kiss, just because Shadow Ball is doing too much, especially if it gets a drop. Psyshock does 43%, which is not enough to offset Soft Boiled and Leftovers recovery. So Blissey's able to take out the Hatterene. It's all down to Jolteon, which gets exactly one turn to take out 3 Mons. That's bad math. And so the Spear Pillar Stratagems, thanks to a very well-built Blissey, advances to their first career NWBA Finals. And for Humalab, unfortunately, the dreams of a repeat championship end here as Kobe falls to 0-4 all time against Blades. And so it comes down to Ruby League Finals Sky Pillar and Big Bluff. As a result of Big Bluff's forfeit in their first matchup, Sky Pillar technically has the sweep and come into this matchup as huge favorites. And out the gate, you see Como trying to go for game immediately, but Donphan does have Ice Spinner, and you see that a Dragon Claw at +1 is only doing about 40%. So this is actually a very good lead here for Big Bluff, who was able to take out one of Sky Pillar's sweepers right out the gate. So this forces Sky Pillar to go into Heat Train, which is faster than Donphan, picks up the KO with the Lava Plume, interestingly enough. This allows Torkoal to come in and set up the sun for the first time in this matchup. Umbreon comes in and sets up Screen on Torkoal, who goes for the rocks and then the Will-O-Wisp, so this is able to get a decent amount of chip on Umbreon, but this allows Sky Pillar to try to get aggressive and go into Manaphy. Venusaur's the double, and reveals that it's actually physical Venusaur. So despite the fact that Manaphy actually has Window Berry in the pocket, it has to leave after going for a Tail Glow because Venusaur goes straight for the grass move. And because it's physical, it's got a chance to take out Umbreon, but unfortunately doesn't pick up the roll, so Umbreon able to stay alive thanks to that Moonlight. Moving forward to turn 15, Sylveon behind a Reflect, also set up by Umbreon, immediately goes for the Calm Mind to try to get some more setup going. Venusaur comes in as Sylveon goes for a Wish, and then the Terra Poison comes out on the Poison Jab, so Sylveon can go up to +2 and get healthy thanks to that Wish. But because this is physical Venusaur, it does in fact carry Earthquake, not enough to KO the Sylveon, who also isn't strong enough to pick up the KO with the Hyper Voice, but on the next turn, thanks to Life Orb chip, both Pokemon go down to keep this tied up at 4 apiece. Heatran and Wake the swaps after the double KO. Clodsire has to come in, but it does have Water Absorb, so it's able to block Walking Wake for the time being. Torkoal comes in as Clodsire sets up Rocks, and then Clodsire getting some good chip with the Earthquake on the next turn as Torkoal goes straight for the Rapid Spin. Torkoal then goes for a Will-O-Wisp, which does miss on the Clodsire, who goes straight for the Poison Jab, expecting a swap from Moltres. And then Espeon comes in on a Balloon, expecting Clodsire to go back for EQ, but good decision making from Skypillar, going straight for the Poison Jab to take out the Balloon and get good chip on Espeon, who goes straight for the Calm Mind. And because Heatran is very bulky and a resist, it's easily able to take the side shot before taking out Espeon with the Heavy Slam. So Torkoal comes back in to put the Sun back up. Wake comes in. Heatran goes for a Power Gem, which does a decent amount of damage, but of course Wake, one of those mons that doesn't need HP. So goes straight for the Draco Meteor, which does not pick up the KO on Umbreon even after the burn, so has to go for a second one before Umbreon goes down. So it allows Heatran to come back in with the Wake at -4. Something's got to get sacked. It's Moltres, who goes down immediately to a Power Gem. Walking Wake comes back in, which means Skypillar's going to have to sack something else. This time it's Manaphy's turn, which also goes down to a Draco Meteor. But because the Sun is out, that means that Heatran's able to come in and force Big Bluff to put the Sun back up. Power Gem picks up the KO on Torkoal, so now it's all on the backs of Walking Wake. But crucially, at this juncture, Big Bluff goes for Draco Meteor instead of potentially Dragon Pulse, which might have been enough to outpace the Clodsire, given that its booster speed, and this is very clearly a Specs Walking Wake. Instead, Clodsire is going to take advantage of the fact that Wake's stats are lowered, gets a poison on the first Poison Jab, heals up with Recover, and then ensures that even future critical hits are not going to be enough to take this thing out. Draco Meteor misses for good measure, and so Walking Wake goes down to Poison on turn 37 to give Skypillar the extremely narrow Game 1 victory. Game 2, Torkoal and Manaphy the leads this time, so Skypillar once again deciding to go for it all right out the gate, goes straight for the Tail Glow, and then Venusaur going for the Growth, forgetting that the Manaphy has a Rindo Berry, gets popped by the stored power immediately. So Kleavor, the swap for Moltres, comes in, but it's not Scarf and it's not Sash. So even in the Sun, Scald enough to KO Kleavor. So Big Bluff already in a very deep hole early on. Sylveon's able to come in to block the Draco Meteor that has to come out to take Manaphy out of the paint. Sylveon immediately goes for the +1 Calm Mind. Hyper Voice, because the Donphan is physically defensive, is enough to 2-hit KO, so even though Donphan gets some good chip on Sylveon, it's gonna go down to a second Hyper Voice. Torkoal comes in to try to put the Sun up, put up rocks, but at this point, Sylveon being able to Wish and Calm Mind against 3 special attackers doesn't really care what Torkoal is gonna do here. So now Sylveon back up to essentially full. Espeon comes in. It's not bulky enough to take a +2 Hyper Voice, so it's up to Walking Wake. And even in the Sun, a Specs Hydro Steam is only doing 23% to Sylveon, who easily picks up the KO with the Hyper Voice. And so it's all over. Big Bluff gets ran out of the building in Game 2. A 6-0 for Skypillar as they advance to the NWBA Finals, Vasser's second appearance in the championship match. A good run for Big Bluff, but their Cinderella story strikes midnight as the Bisharps fall to the Delta Dragons. Alright, so we will now move to the final segment of today's episode, a preview of our finals matchup, the tail of the tape, and what we can come to expect for the final matchup of Season 8. So now we are here at the end of our journey, and let's take one final look at the playoff bracket and how we got here before we move into our finals matchup. Starting with the Ruby League, Big Bluff emerged as the winner of the wild card over Kurowe. And as they moved on to Ruby Semis, they pulled off one of the great upsets in NWBA history, knocking off the top-seeded Lavender Town Pranksters. As far as the other Ruby Semis were concerned, the 3-seeded Skypillar Delta Dragons advanced over the Rose Tower Kaparajas in a very close set. And then Skypillar took care of business, 2-0ing Big Bluff and ending their Cinderella run to advance from the Ruby side. Over on the Sapphire side, Goldenrod won that wild card matchup over Littleroot before going down in straight games to the top-seeded Spear Pillar Stratagems. Humala got their championship defense off to a good start by taking out the 2-seeded Mauville Mimikyus before falling in 3 games to another classic set to Spear Pillar. So, the top seed in the Sapphire League advanced to the NWBA Finals, whereas the 3 seed in the Ruby League advanced as far as the Ruby side is concerned. So there you have it. You have your finals matchup. You see how we got there. And now, all we have left to talk about is one final best of 5 to determine who will be our Season 8 champions. So, as we take a look at our finals matchup, Sky Pillar versus Spear Pillar. Sky Pillar employing Heatran, Iron Hands, and Como as OUs. Manaphy, Hydreigon, and Clodsire as UUs. Azulf and Umbreon as the RUs. Sylveon, Decidueye as the NUs. And then PUs in Palmot and Electros. Balanced roster. We've seen balance and bulky offense be the name of the game for Sky Pillar. Although they will be without Iron Hands for this matchup. That was the banned Mon that can basically trade into any Mon on any roster thanks to its great power and great bulk. So that is a very crucial piece of Sky Pillar's offense off the table. That being said, they will get to operate with their Terra Captain MVP finalist, the star of the team, Azulf. So that is a big boon for the Delta Dragons. For Spear Pillar, they employ triple OUs as well in Tornadus, Therian, Great Tusk, and Darkrai, UUs in Slowking and Superior, RUs in Jirachi and Blissey, triple NU core of Arcanine, Rhyperior, Tentacruel, and then PUs in Oricorio, Bile, and Grimmsnarl. Spear Pillar, a little bit more of a star-studded roster, the only team with 4 All-Stars, very powerful team that can be very good at playing balance. Unfortunately, they will be missing their ace in the hole, Jirachi, the Terra Captain, the Mon that Blades loves to employ as a late set counter in long matchups. So they're not going to have that advantage, but they do have the advantage of having all their OUs at their disposal. Granted, they all can't hit the field at the same time, but the fact that Torntea, Great Tusk, and Darkrai will all be available is very huge. As far as the numbers go, Spear Pillar was the better team in the regular season. Better win-loss record against playoff teams, better game count, better win differential. As far as the Mons, the numbers were pretty close, as of just slightly edging out anyone on Spear Pillar's roster as far as KOs and points. So as far as the most productive Mon on the field, it looks to be Azulf. As far as postseason anecdotes, Spear Pillar, this is their first time in the finals, so they have not been there before, obviously, and they have a 3-2 playoff record. Vasser, on the other hand, a lot of playoff experience, 7-3 postseason record, has been to the finals before. It was a loss in 5 games in Season 3 to King, but he has made it there before. As far as the last time these teams met, it was in Week 2, where Spear Pillar won 2-0. The teams are quite different compared to where they were back then, so they're not a whole lot to glean from that matchup, but the numbers do say that Spear Pillar looks to be a slight favorite heading into our NWBA Finals matchup. Alright, that's going to wrap it up for today's episode. Thank you all for watching. I've been your host, King Vasser. Coming up next, the season finale of Season 8. Sky Pillar, Spear Pillar for all the marbles. Who will emerge as your NWBA champions? We'll see you soon.